You saved me. So now, according to the sacred law, I must bear you children, said the Apache woman.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind carried a steady whine across the basin, pushing grit against the sides of the cabin and making the stovepipe clatter. The land around the place stretched open and bare, a long sweep of sage and rock that only broke where the creek cut through. It was late winter of 1882, and nights like this still had the bite of snow, even if the ground was already patchy and hard. Inside the cabin, the man sat at the table sharpening a knife, his lantern swaying faintly from a draft. He was 34, lean from work, with a frame hardened by years of lifting fence posts and carrying feed sacks. His dark hair fell over a jaw that carried more stubble than he usually kept. Scars lined one forearm, marks from the war he didn't talk about. Once he had a family, a wife who hadn't survived a fever, a child lost before a first birthday. He had come west to get away from the memory of a graveyard back east, building this cabin on the far edge of the basin, so no one asked questions and no one needed him to talk. The ranching work kept his hands full, but it never dulled the empty silence that waited in the room each night. That was why he noticed the sound outside, something too heavy to be a branch, too soft to be a horse. He set the knife down, pulled his coat from the peg, and stepped onto the porch with a lantern in one hand. The light swept across the frozen ground, past the fence posts, and caught a shape collapsed near the wire. He tightened his grip on the lantern. For a moment, his chest clenched with the old reflex of war, expecting a trick, some ambush. But then he saw the long braid, the bare legs against the snow, and he realized it was a woman. She was face down, her body folded in on itself. The torn deerskin dress clung to her with frost. Beads and shells still dangled from the seams, though most had broken away. Her skin was bronze and bruised, her lips cracked. He felt a rush of conflict, fear at the risk of bringing a stranger into his home, stress at what danger might follow her, but also a sharp edge of empathy he couldn't set aside. He lowered to his knees, touched her shoulder. Her skin was cold, breath faint but there. He slid his arms under her, lifting carefully. She weighed hardly more than a sack of grain, and it unsettled him, how light she was. He carried her inside, the door thudding shut on the wind, and laid her on his bed. For a moment he just stood there, heart heavy. He had come west to keep to himself, to avoid being tied down again, and yet here was a decision he couldn't ignore. Leave her to die, or help her, and accept whatever came with it. He fetched water from the stove, dampened a cloth, and cleaned her face. Dirt and dried blood came away in streaks. Rope burns marked her wrists. He muttered low, not expecting her to hear, "They left you to die out there." His jaw tightened as he said it, because he knew what that meant. Someone wanted her gone. He tucked his coat over her and set bread and beans on the small table nearby, close enough that when she woke she would smell them. The lantern's glow softened her features. She looked younger than he first thought, no more than 24, but her body showed the toll of hunger and flight. He sat in the chair beside the bed, boots planted, hands clasped together. Thoughts churned. What if whoever hurt her came looking? What if he was dragged into a fight he didn't want? But looking at her shallow breathing, he knew he had already chosen. He wouldn't put her back outside. So he sat through the night, eyes on her, stove ticking, and the smell of beans filling the room. The decision had been made the moment he lifted her from the snow. And though he didn't yet know her name, he knew she had crossed into his life, and nothing about the quiet existence he had built out here would stay the same. Morning came slow, a pale light edging through the small window above the bed. The stove had burned down to embers, but still gave off a faint warmth. The man rose from the chair, his back stiff from sitting upright all night, and poured fresh water into the kettle. He checked the woman, her breathing steadier now, skin not so cold. He hadn't moved her dress aside, but he had seen enough bruises on her arms, her shins, and her wrists to know she had been treated roughly before collapsing at his fence. What he didn't know was who had done it, how far she had come, or if someone was still chasing her. Her eyelids fluttered. She stirred against the weight of his coat, then opened her eyes, dark and watchful even through the haze of exhaustion. For a long moment, she looked at him without speaking, her gaze steady but uncertain, as though deciding whether he was a threat or not. He kept his hands where she could see them, on his knees, voice low and even. Water. He set the cup within reach on the small table and stepped back. Her fingers trembled when she reached for it. She drank, each swallow careful, as though afraid it might be taken away. When the cup was empty, she held it between both palms and finally spoke, her voice no more than a whisper, but clear enough. You saved me, so now, according to the sacred law, I must bear you a child. The man froze, caught off guard. He had expected fear, perhaps a plea for food or for shelter. Not this. The words hung heavy in the room, carrying a kind of finality he hadn't invited. He shook his head, his voice firm but not harsh. No law binds you here. You don't owe me anything. Her eyes narrowed faintly, not in anger, but in confusion, as though she couldn't understand why he would turn aside what her people had taught her. My people say, if a man saves a woman's life, she gives him life in return. She touched the edge of her torn dress, fingers brushing a broken strand of beadwork. It is how no one remains alone. He leaned back slightly, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He remembered her bruises, the rope burns at her wrists, the half-starved way she had felt in his arms. You've had enough taken from you, he said. This place, this house, you can rest here without fear. No bargain, no debt. For a moment her face softened, though suspicion still lingered. She looked around the cabin, taking in the rifle propped by the door, the single chair, the rough-hewn table. The life of a man alone. She asked in a halting tone, why are you here, so far from the town? He paused, weighing whether to answer. Part of him wanted to stay silent, keep his past buried where it belonged. But he saw in her eyes that she needed to know who had taken her in, whether he was a man she could trust. I fought in the war, he said slowly, his hand brushing the scar on his forearm. I lost a wife after. Lost a child, too. I came out here to start over, to stay clear of folks and their questions. His gaze dropped for a moment, didn't figure on company. Her lips pressed together, as though she carried a story just as heavy but wasn't ready to give it yet. She pulled his coat closer around her shoulders and whispered, I was cast out. There was no food left for me, no family left for me. Her voice caught, but she steadied it. I walked until I could not. The man nodded once. He didn't press her for more. Then you're here now, he said. You'll eat. You'll rest. He slid the plate of beans and bread toward her. That's all that's asked. She looked down at the food, her hands trembling again, not only from hunger, but from the strange weight of this moment. Slowly she ate, eyes flicking up to him now and then, as though testing whether he would change his mind, whether he would demand the thing she had offered under the law. But he didn't. He just sat in the chair, quiet, watchful, giving her the space to decide what came next. By the time the light had spread fully into the room, the questions anyone might have asked were already being answered. Why she had come, why he lived alone, what bound them both to this meeting. The law of her people had brought her words to his door, but his choice not to claim them left something else between them. An uneasy, tentative trust that neither had expected but both understood would decide the days ahead. The third morning came with a sharper wind, the kind that rattled the door hinges and sent dust scratching along the window frame. The man had risen early, stepping out to the corral to check the gelding and the fence line, but he found his mind drifting back to the cabin each time the wind cut through him. He worried, not about danger from the woman, but about what she carried with her. Was someone still hunting her? Would the town, if they learned she was here, bring trouble to his door? These questions pressed on him, but when he opened the door and saw her at the table, mending the torn seam of her dress with thread she had taken from his small box of supplies, his doubts eased enough for him to simply watch a moment. Her hands moved steady, threading a needle with care despite the bruises at her wrists. She had cleaned herself with water from the basin, and though her dress was still ragged, it now sat closer to how it had once been. Deerskin pulled straight, beads tapped lightly with each stitch. The neckline remained low from the damage, but she didn't try to hide it. She looked up when he stepped inside, eyes steady, not startled as before. He noticed her breathing had grown even, her shoulders no longer hunched as if braced for a blow. "You should rest," he said, pulling his coat from his shoulders. "I've rested enough," she answered quietly. Her voice was still rough from thirst and cold, but it carried more strength now. "If I stay here, I must help." He studied her for a moment, torn between telling her she owed nothing and recognizing the pride in her words. It was the first real sign of her choosing something for herself since she had arrived. He gave a small nod. "The woodpile's low. I'll show you." He took her outside, the wind tugging at her hair, and led her around to the side of the cabin where the logs sat under a canvas sheet. He picked up the axe and split one clean stroke through a length, then handed the smaller pieces to her. She carried them to the porch, her steps careful but sure. He could see she was still weak. Her hands trembled slightly when she bent to set the wood down, but she didn't stop. When she came back, he said, "Not too much. Your strength isn't back yet." Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was the hint of something unguarded there. "If I do nothing, I will feel useless. I cannot be useless again." He understood. He thought of the months after the war, when he had drifted from camp to camp with no work that mattered, just a body carrying scars and a head full of noise. Work had saved him: fence lines, horses, feed sacks, a shovel in the earth. He set the axe aside and gave her one of the smaller tools, a hatchet, to trim kindling. "Then do what you can," he said. Later, inside, she baked bread with what little flour remained. Her fingers dusted white across the table as she shaped the loaf, and when she leaned forward to check the stove, the torn line of her dress shifted again, showing the curve of her chest. He caught his eyes wandering, but forced himself back to the task of mending tack at the bench. He didn't want her to think he had taken her in for that. Still, the pull of attraction gnawed at him, one he hadn't felt in years, and it unsettled him almost as much as it steadied him. She noticed his silence, but said nothing, only set the bread to rise and later placed a piece in front of him. When her hand brushed his as she set the plate down, both froze a fraction of a second, then carried on as though nothing had passed between them. By evening, the questions that might have lingered in anyone's mind were beginning to be answered. What would she do now that she had food, whether she intended to leave, whether he would push her to honor the law she had spoken of? She had shown her choice in action, working beside him, cooking with his flour, stitching her dress. And he, by not stopping her, had shown he meant to let her belong without debt. When night came, he gestured to the bed. "You take it. I'll keep the chair." She hesitated, then whispered, "You have done more than I expected." "Why?" He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I remember what it feels like to be left with nothing. No one should face that alone." She lay down then, his coat pulled close, and he returned to the chair. The stove glowed, boots set neatly by the hearth. The house held only their breathing and the low hum of the wind through the trees, and for the first time since she had stumbled into his life, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like a beginning. The next day brought clearer skies, though the air still held the bite of winter. The man stepped out to the corral after breakfast, boots crunching over the hard ground, and she followed a few steps behind, holding his coat tighter around her shoulders. She had eaten well the night before and color had returned to her face, yet he could see the stiffness in her walk, the way she favored her left leg where bruises had not fully healed. Still, she kept pace, eyes fixed on the horse that lifted its head over the fence at their approach. "This one's called Bay," he said, resting a hand on the animal's neck. "Strong, steady, carries me where I need to go." She reached out slowly, her hand hovering before touching the horse's muzzle. The gelding snorted, then settled under her palm. Her lips moved in a faint whisper, words in her tongue, perhaps thanks or greeting. He realized he hadn't asked yet where exactly she came from, or if she had anyone left. People in the basin whispered often enough about Apache raids, about trouble in the hills, but seeing her there, frail, bruised, trying to steady her hand against the horse's warmth, he didn't want to press her with questions she wasn't ready to answer. He showed her the blanket and saddle, how the cinch held tight, how to step with the left foot into the stirrup. When she hesitated, He set his hands where she could see them, one on the saddle horn, the other offered open at her side. "I'll steady you," he said quietly. For a moment her body went rigid, memories pulling at her, but then she let out a breath and gave a small nod. He placed his hand at her waist, lifted, and she swung her leg across with surprising ease. Sitting high on the saddle, she looked both proud and uncertain, her back straight, fingers tight on the horn. The dress pulled against her figure, the curve of her hips and chest outlined against the leather. And though he noticed it, he forced his focus on the reins. "Sit deep. Don't fight the horse. Let him move under you," he instructed. She nodded, jaw set, taking the words in as if each one mattered. They rode along the edge of the basin, the wind sweeping harder here, cutting through the sage. He led on foot, one hand to the lead, pointing out where fence posts leaned from thawing ground. She watched closely as he showed her how wire must be tied back to hold against weight, asking questions in short, quiet bursts. It struck him how quickly she tried to learn, as though afraid she might be turned away if she did not prove her worth. When they stopped at the creek, the ice cracked faintly at the edges, but the water still ran. She slipped once on the bank, and he caught her arm, holding her steady until she found balance. For a second, she stood very close, her braid brushing his sleeve, and he felt the tension in her arm ease when she realized he wasn't letting her fall. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "This creek's where you'll get water. But mind the rocks. They'll take you down quick." On the way back, the wind cut sharp, stinging her cheeks, and without thinking, he pulled off his scarf and wrapped it around her throat, tucking it into her dress. She blinked up at him, startled by the gesture. "Why?" she asked. "So you don't freeze." His voice stayed even, but inside he felt a stir he hadn't allowed in years. A small, unfamiliar warmth that came not from duty, but from wanting her safe. When they reached the cabin, she lingered by the corral fence, one hand resting on the gelding's mane. She looked back at him and asked softly, "You live alone because of what you lost. Why let me stay?" He thought a moment before answering. "Because no one should be left to die out there. I know what it is to be alone too long." Her gaze held his, steady, searching. She gave no promise, but the way she followed him back to the cabin without hesitation spoke louder than words. Inside, she set to cooking beans again, moving with more ease than before, and he worked on mending a piece of tack at the bench. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people beginning to share the same ground. By the time the lantern was lit, questions left unspoken in the first days, whether she would leave once she was strong, whether he would send her away, were answered in the quiet rhythm of their work. She had chosen to learn, and he had chosen to teach. The rest, though neither admitted it aloud, was already taking root between them. The flour sack had gone light, the coffee nearly gone, and the man knew he couldn't put off a trip to the trading post any longer. He woke before dawn, checked the gelding, and set aside what little coin he had left from his last cattle job. When he came back inside, she was already awake, sitting at the table with his coat wrapped around her shoulders, her braid pulled neat. She looked at the small pile of coins and then at him, her face tight with worry. "Is it enough?" she asked. "Enough for flour, sugar, coffee. Maybe a bit of thread," he said. He didn't want to admit how close he cut it sometimes, how most of what he earned went to keeping the horse and the roof sound. She stood, her movements cautious but sure. "I will come. You should not go alone." He studied her a moment, uncertain. He thought of the way some men in town spoke when Apache women came near, the looks that turned sharp and mean. He didn't want those eyes on her, but he also saw the set of her jaw, the pride in her voice when she said it. She had been cast out once. She would not be hidden again. Finally, he gave a short nod. "All right, stay close to me." The ride down into the valley was quiet but steady. She sat the horse better now, her back straight, her hands looser on the reins. He walked alongside, boots crunching in the thawing dirt, leading them toward the cluster of buildings that made up the post. Smoke lifted from a few chimneys, and a handful of wagons stood out front. Inside, the store smelled of kerosene, flour, and leather. A man behind the counter, gray-bearded, with spectacles perched low, looked up as they entered. His eyes flicked from the cowboy to the woman and back again, pausing on the beads still hanging loose from her mended dress. The man felt her tense beside him, and he made sure to keep his body between her and the rest of the room. Coffee, flour, sugar, the cowboy said in his low voice, setting the coins on the counter. And that spool of dark thread there. The storekeep measured out the goods without a word, but two other men at the far end of the room muttered something under their breath. The cowboy heard the word squaw and stray, his jaw tightening. He kept his eyes on the counter, his hand resting lightly at his belt where no one could miss the meaning. The muttering stopped. The woman, meanwhile, studied the shelves. Her hand hovered over a strip of soft leather and a tin of salve. She looked at him, silent, asking without asking. He nodded once, adding both to the pile. "For the horse tack," he said aloud, though they both knew one was for her braid and the other for her cracked hands. When they stepped outside, she let out a breath she had been holding. "They do not want me here," she said quietly. "They don't have to want you," he answered. "They just have to leave you be." He helped her down from a horse and placed the supplies in the saddlebag. "I won't let anyone touch you." On the ride back, the valley opened wide again, the basin stretching under the high sky. She seemed calmer, even lifted, as though she had faced something and come through it. When they reached the creek, she dismounted on her own, though the hem of her dress caught on the saddle and lifted high enough to show the line of her calf. She didn't flinch this time, didn't pull away from his glance. Instead, she said, "Show me again how the water is taken without slipping." He steadied the rocks with his boot and guided her steps, one hand lightly on her arm. She filled the dipper, lifted it without spilling, and gave the faintest smile of satisfaction. For a moment, watching her there, he realized the change. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning how to belong in this place. That evening, back at the cabin, she unbraided her hair by the lantern, letting it fall free, black and heavy down her back. He busied himself with the tack, but his eyes kept straying, the quiet pull between them stronger than either had spoken aloud. The loaf of bread she baked filled the room with warmth, and when she set a piece before him, her hand brushed his again. Neither pulled back quickly this time. Questions that might have lingered from the first days, whether she would always hide, whether he would always keep her apart from the world, were settled in the way they had faced the post together. She had walked into that room beside him, not behind him, and he had let her. In their silence that night, as the lantern burned low, the truth was clear. They were no longer just surviving the same space. They were beginning to share it. The next night, the wind came slow and steady, not sharp like before, but carrying the smell of thaw, the promise that winter was beginning to loosen its grip. Inside the cabin, the stove burned steady, the bread she had baked cooling on the table, and the lantern cast a warm glow that softened the rough lines of the place. He sat at the bench mending tack, his sleeves rolled up, the scar on his forearm playing in the light. She had been watching him in quiet stretches all evening, her eyes lingering not only on his work, but on the man himself, on the life she was now sharing piece by piece. When he finished tying off the leather strap, she rose from where she had been kneeling by the stove. She crossed the room with careful steps, still uncertain of how close she could stand without breaking the fragile peace that had grown between them. At the table, she stopped, eyes dropping to his arm. "That scar," she said softly, her accent pulling at the words. "How did you get it?" He glanced down, then back at her. For a moment he thought of deflecting, of leaving the past where it belonged, but she had given him pieces of her story already. The exile, the hunger, the bruises she still carried. It was her right to ask for something in return. He rested his arm on the table, the scar rough in the lamplight. "From the war. Cavalry fight. Blade caught me here. He didn't live through it. I did." His voice was steady, but he felt the old weight in his chest just speaking the words. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the scar. Her touch was light but deliberate, as if testing whether he would pull away. He didn't. She traced the line once, then turned her wrist to show her own. The faint rope marks that were almost healed but still visible. "This is mine," she said. "I was bound and led like an animal. I thought I would die tied to a tree. I did not want to hide it. For the first time since she had come to him, he looked at her not only with guarded sympathy, but with the raw honesty of someone who understood. He said quietly, "You don't owe me anything for being alive. You don't owe me by law or by rope or by any man's hand. You stay because you choose to." Her eyes shone in the lantern's glow, not with tears, but with a kind of steadiness he hadn't seen before. "I know," she whispered. "That is why I stay." The silence that followed carried a weight neither wanted to break with too many words. She stepped closer, so near that the warmth of her body mingled with his. He hesitated, his heart tight, torn between the fear of overstepping and the deeper fear of letting her slip away if he didn't. Then she lifted her chin, closing the distance herself, and their mouths met. The kiss was slow, uncertain at first, then stronger as his hand came up to rest against her shoulder and hers pressed lightly to his chest. He could feel the fast rhythm of her heartbeat through the thin fabric of his shirt, and she could feel the steady strength in the way he held her, but did not pull her closer than she wanted. When they parted, her breath caught, and she didn't step back. They stood like that, faces close in the lamplight, the world outside reduced to the soft hum of wind in the cottonwoods and the tick of the stove. He thought of how she had come into his life half dead, of the law she had spoken on waking, and of the choice they had just made together. It wasn't duty binding them now. It was something stronger, something they had both chosen without speaking it aloud. Later, when she lay down on the bed, she did not turn away from him as she had before. She left her hair loose across the pillow, and when he sat in the chair, she reached a hand toward him. He took it, his rough palm closing gently around hers, and held it there until sleep took her. The questions left unspoken from the first chapters, whether she was bound only by the sacred law, whether he wanted her only out of pity, whether she could ever trust a man's hands again, were answered in that simple truth. She had chosen to touch him, and he had chosen to hold on. The morning after the kiss came quiet, the air outside cold, but with the edge of thaw creeping into the ground. He woke in the chair, his hands still clasped loosely around hers, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar hollow that usually followed sleep. She stirred, her hair loose across the pillow, eyes opening slow. She didn't pull her hand away when she realized their fingers were still joined. Instead, she held it tighter, as though anchoring herself to something she had decided not to let go of. He rose to put wood on the fire, the routine steadying him. Yet inside, he felt a weight shifting. He had taken in strangers before, men on the trail, a neighbor's boy with a broken arm, but this was different. She wasn't a passing duty. She had become part of the place, part of him. The kiss the night before had told him what he already knew but had been afraid to admit. She wasn't staying because of the loss she spoke of. She was staying because she wanted to. As the fire crackled, she sat up, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. For the first time, she asked about the land itself. Why here? Why this cabin? So far from others. He poured water into the kettle and leaned against the stove. He had avoided that question in earlier days, but she had shared enough of her past for him to give her something honest. After the war, after I buried my family, I needed a place where no one knew my name. I built this cabin with my own hands. Out here, no one asks about the graves I left behind. Out here, I can work, eat, and keep breathing without explaining myself. His voice was rough but steady. She listened, her dark eyes fixed on him. "And still you are alone," she said, not unkindly, but as a fact that hung heavy in the air. He nodded. "I thought that was how it had to be." She looked down at her hands, the faint rope marks now fading. "My people said I was no longer useful. They gave me to men who only saw me as weight. When I ran, I thought maybe it was better to die. But I did not die. I found your fire." Her voice wavered, then steadied again. "If I stay, it is not because of sacred law. It is because I choose not to die alone." The words struck him deeper than he expected. He set the kettle aside and crossed the room, kneeling in front of her. His hand brushed back a strand of her hair, and she let him. "Then stay," he said quietly. "Stay because you want to, not because you owe me." Her lips parted as though to answer, but instead she leaned forward, closing the small space between them. Their mouths met again, not hesitant this time, but deliberate. The kiss carried weight, the kind that confirmed what neither had dared to speak aloud. His hand steadied at her waist, hers pressed against his chest. She didn't flinch under his touch, and he didn't claim more than she gave. When they parted, the silence stretched, but it was different now. Less guarded, more certain. She whispered, "I want to stay." Later, he pulled a plank of juniper from the corner and set it on the table. She watched as he marked a line with a pencil, shaping the curve of wood that would one day be part of a cradle. She frowned at first, not understanding. "What are you making?" He looked at her with a small, serious smile. "Something for the future. Something we can build together." Her breath caught, her hand moving unconsciously to her middle, though she said nothing. Instead, she stood behind him, resting her hand gently against his back as he drew the lines. That night, when the lantern burned low, they lay close, their hands finding each other in the dark. They didn't rush what was still new between them, but neither pretended it hadn't changed. For anyone watching, the questions left unanswered in the first days, whether she would ever see herself as more than a burden, whether he would ever allow himself to build a life again, were beginning to find their answers in simple gestures: a hand held through the night, a kiss without hesitation, the mark of a cradle drawn on rough wood. The thaw came sudden, the snow retreating to shadows and the creek swelling with cold water rushing against its banks. The cabin felt different now, less like a shelter for one, more like a home where two people moved in rhythm. The woman no longer lingered uncertain at the edges of the room. She worked beside him, shaping dough, trimming kindling, walking with him to the corral. The silence between them was no longer heavy with suspicion, but full of unspoken understanding. That evening, after the day's work, she fetched water from the creek. He heard the clang of the dipper on stone, and then the sound of her slipping. He was out the door before he thought, boots pounding the damp earth, and reached her just as she fell. His arms caught her, pulling her up before the water dragged her. She laughed once, sharp with nerves, but her breath hitched as pain shot from her ankle. He saw the twist, the swelling starting already. Without hesitation, he lifted her, carrying her back to the cabin. Inside, he set her down on the bed, unlaced her moccasin, and wrapped her ankle with strips of cloth. She winced, but didn't pull away. Instead, she caught his hand and held it, her grip tight, her eyes locked on his. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Not of falling, of being left there. I thought for a moment I would be left again." He shook his head firmly. "Not while I'm breathing. You won't be left." Her eyes softened. She released a breath she had been holding since the night he found her at the fence. She pulled him closer, her hand rising to his face, and this time when their lips met it was not hesitant. It was steady, sure. He felt her body lean into his, not with fear, but with choice. The lantern flickered low as their hands found each other with more certainty than before. He traced the curve of her shoulder, the line of her back, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. She touched the scar at his side where the skin was uneven, where he had once thought no one could look at him without flinching. Her hand rested there without fear, her eyes saying what her voice did not, that she accepted all of him, the past and the wounds. They lay down together, moving carefully, not rushing but not pulling away. Her breath warmed his neck, her hair spread across his chest as she pressed close. He kissed her slowly, and she answered with a quiet urgency that told him she was not bound by duty anymore, not by sacred law, but by her own will. When they gave themselves fully to each other, it was not an act of survival, but of trust, a decision sealed in silence and closeness. Afterward, she rested against him, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. For the first time since he had taken her in, she fell asleep without clutching his coat for protection. And for the first time since he buried his family, he felt the weight of grief lift enough for peace to take its place. Questions left hanging in the earlier days, whether she could allow herself to be touched without fear, whether he could ever let himself hold someone again, were answered in that night. She had not surrendered out of obligation. He had not claimed her out of loneliness. They had chosen each other, and the act of staying was no longer spoken of but lived in the quiet rise and fall of their breathing as they slept side by side. Spring came across the basin with a rush of clear water and soft earth breaking under boot heels. The cottonwoods budded pale green, and the creek no longer carried ice at its edges. The cabin that had once stood as a place of silence for one now carried the sound of two voices, low, steady, not often many words, but enough to fill what had been empty. The cradle he had begun in the days after their first kiss now stood nearly finished by the window, smooth juniper boards fitted clean and tight, the curve of the rockers cut true. She had sewn a small blanket from scraps of cloth, her fingers tying a shell at one corner so it clicked softly when the breeze moved through. That morning, as he set the last peg into place, she came to him, her face lit by the sun coming through the doorway. She had grown stronger with each week, her walk steady now, the hollows in her cheeks filled with health. She still bore the scars of rope on her wrists and the faint mark of bruises across her shins, but they no longer defined her. She stood tall, her braid neat, her dress mended though still carrying the worn threads of her journey. "You've built a place for a child," she said softly, her eyes on the cradle. He nodded, setting down the tool. "I've built it because I mean to have a future again. Not the kind I thought I had lost, but the kind I didn't expect to find." His voice caught, but steadied as he looked at her. "With you." She stepped close, her hand sliding into his rough palm. For a long moment, she said nothing, and he thought she might hold her silence, as she had so often before. But then she placed his hand against her middle, her eyes never leaving his. "It is not just for a future we hope for," she whispered. "It is for the child already inside me." He froze, his breath held tight in his chest. The weight of her words struck him harder than any battle had. For years he had carried the grief of burying a child he never had the chance to raise, a wife taken before her time. He had believed that part of his life ended in the ground. Now here, in the cabin he had built to escape the world, she was giving it back to him. His hand pressed against her belly, not yet showing, but enough that the promise of it settled into him like solid earth. He drew her against him, his face burying briefly in her hair, his voice low and rough. "You're my wife. You'll never be cast out again. Not by law, not by men, not by hunger." Later that week, they rode into the valley together. At the parson's small house, he spoke the vows without hesitation, his voice steady where once it had always wavered when speaking of the past. She answered with quiet strength, her accent wrapping around the words, but her meaning clear. The parson's book recorded her name beside his, a line of ink sealing what their hearts had already decided. When they returned home, he set the cradle by the bed, running a hand across the smooth wood. She placed the blanket inside, then turned to him. "I stay because I chose you," she said firmly. "Not because of a law, not because of a debt. I stay because this is my place now." He pulled her into his arms, the weight of the past finally loosening. For the first time in years, he smiled without restraint. The cabin held their breathing, the stove ticking as it cooled, the sound of the horse shifting in the corral outside. There was no question left unanswered, no doubt about why she had stayed, no doubt about whether he could love again, no doubt about the life growing between them. The man who once lived only to keep breathing now had someone to breathe beside him. The woman who once believed she had nothing left now carried a child, a husband, and a home. And as the wind moved softly through the cottonwoods, they stood together, knowing that the law binding them was not written by others, but by the choice they had made and the family they had built. This was the end of their wandering and the beginning of something lasting. Nothing uncertain remained. Their story had found its place.